We're ready? Hello? Hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Gracie Mansion. So happy to have you here tonight, whether you're with us in the room or we have folks, we hope, on their smartphones and at home on their computers watching our live stream. So welcome, and we're excited to be here tonight for the third installation in the second season of the Gracie Book Club. So welcome all. I am Gabrielle Fialka, Senior Advisor to the Mayor and Director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships. And in that role, I get to oversee the Gracie Mansion Conservancy, which has been incredibly rewarding doing programming like this. And the mission of the Conservancy, in addition to taking care of this beautiful home, is to really think about how to make Gracie Mansion the people's house and how to invite New Yorkers into the house to create access, particularly in arts and culture, for all New Yorkers, and think about how to bring the house and that access and opportunity to all New Yorkers who may not be able to come across the threshold. So with events and programming like the Gracie Mansion Book Club, we're able to do so. We've been busy. The last year, we've had our book club meetings all throughout the city, in all 5 boroughs, and we're back at Gracie again. Our first season, the theme was Envisioning Distant Neighbors, and we explored the themes of immigration and the immigrant experience here in New York City, so relevant to all the topics we're thinking about today. And the second season, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the house being the home of the city's mayor. Fiorello LaGuardia moved in 1942. And so this season's theme is about that era, that period of 1942, and thinking about New York City at the crossroads of war and the city where our soldiers, the majority, were shipped out and came home, and munitions and supplies went out through New York Harbor, and a period that saw the Puerto Rican migration, the African American Great Migration, the start of the LaGuardia period and progressivism in New York. So we're thinking about those themes today and how it ties into New York City, today's New York City then, and when this house was built in 1799. And that brings us to tonight, where we're here to discuss the American masterpiece, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. It's been 65 years since he wrote that book, and of course it endures as one of the greatest American novels and reminds us that while much progress has been made, we still have so far to go. It is for this reason that The Invisible Man endures as one of the most popular novels of our time. The themes of uncertainty and fear and visibility and identity connect today with so many of our marginalized and vulnerable communities, whether Muslim American, transgender, the Dreamers, African Americans. These themes and this work is as thought-provoking now as it was then. And to discuss this with us today, we're so honored to be joined by 2 incredible doctors and soon-to-be academics and experts and folks who have thought so much about this work. So pleased to introduce Alondra Nelson, the president of the Social Science Research Council and professor of sociology at Columbia University, and Clint Smith, writer, teacher, and PhD candidate at Harvard University. Alondra writes and lectures widely on the intersections of science, technology, and social inequality. And for 6 years, she was an associate professor of African American Studies and Sociology at Yale University. In her current role at Columbia, she is the founding co-director of the Columbia University Women's Gender and Sexuality Council. Clint Smith's 2016 essay in The New Yorker, titled Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man as a Parable of Our Time, explores how undocumented immigrant students saw their experiences reflected in the novel we're so pleased to be discussing tonight. And before we get into our discussion, we're happy to share with you a message tonight from First Lady Chirlane McCray, who really counts the book club as her book club, but duty calls and she was not able to be with us tonight. So join with me in watching this video from First Lady McCray. Thank you all so much. Look forward to it.
Hello, Gracie Book Club. Thank you for joining us, whether you're here in person or tuning in from home. This evening, we will explore what it means for people to be systematically unseen and unheard and unrepresented. That kind of invisibility is what Ralph Ellison evinces with his masterpiece, Invisible Man. And in doing so, he tells a story that still resonates with us deeply today. For so many Americans, the struggle for visibility and representation is ongoing. Although our country has come a long way since Ellison wrote this game-changing work of fiction, books, movies, and television shows that feature positive Black characters and experiences are still rare. That's why Black Panther is getting such a tremendous response and extraordinary appreciation. Little Black girls and boys, and adults too, in theaters across the country are seeing themselves as superheroes. They are seeing themselves, period. That's a victory for visibility. And Ellison helped pave the way when Invisible Man made him the first African American to win the National Book Award 65 years ago. Here's what he said when he accepted the award. Despite my personal failures, there must be possible a fiction which can arrive at the truth about the human condition, here and now, with all the bright magic of the fairy tale. The endurance of Invisible Man proves Ellison was successful in revealing the unsavory truths of our human condition, and he inspired countless other writers, leaders, and thinkers in the process. I'm delighted that you all have joined our distinguished panelists for what I know will be a lively and thought-provoking discussion about Invisible Man and the messages this book has for us today. Thank you again, and happy reading.
How's everybody doing this evening? Good, good. Thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you to the folks here at Gracie for having me. I'm going to start by reading a section toward the end of the book, one of the most famous scenes in the novel, the funeral scene after Clifton is killed by police, and obviously a lot of the talk and discussion animating the thinking around this novel is both how it illuminates in many ways how far we've come, but also illuminates the fact that some phenomena that are reflected in the book are still recurring every single day here in the United States, some 60-odd years later. And so this is one of the most powerful scenes in the book from my mind, and so I'm going to share it with you all, and then I think we'll hop right into the discussion. And this is the protagonist speaking to about to speak to the crowd after Clifton's been killed. I looked down into their sun-swept faces, digging for the words and feeling a futility about it all and an anger. For this they gathered by the thousands. What were they waiting to hear? Why had they come? For what reason was this different from that which had a red-cheeked boy thrill at Clifton's failing to the earth? What did they want, and what could they do? Why hadn't they come when they could have stopped it all? What are you waiting for me to tell you? I shouted suddenly, my voice strangely clipped on the windless air. What good will it do? What if I say that this isn't a funeral, that it's a holiday celebration, that if you stick around, the band will end up playing the damn it, the hell, the fun's all over? Or do you expect to see some magic? The dead rise up and walk again? Go home. He's dead as he'll ever be. He's dead. That's the end of the beginning, and there's no encore. There will be no miracles, and there's no one here to preach a sermon. Go home. Forget him. He's inside this box, newly dead. Go home and don't think about him. He's dead, and you've all got to think about what you can do. I paused. They were whispering and looking upward. I've told you to go home, I shouted, but you keep standing there. Don't you know it's hot out here in the sun? So what if you wait for a little that I can tell you, for the little that I can tell you? Can I say in 20 minutes what was building 21 years and ended in 20 seconds? What are you waiting for? When all I can tell you is his name. And when I tell you, what will you know that you didn't know already, except perhaps his name? They were listening intently and as though looking at me, but the pattern of my voice upon the air, not looking at me, but the pattern of my voice upon the air. All right, you do the listening into the sun, and I'll try to tell you what he wasn't. Then you can go home and forget it. Forget it. His name was Clifton, and they shot him down. His name was Clifton, and he was tall, and some folks thought him handsome. And though he didn't believe it, I think he was. His tight roll curls, or call them naps or kinks, he's dead, uninterested, and except for a few young girls, it doesn't matter. Have you got it? Can you see him? Think of your brother or your cousin John, his lips thick with an upward curve at the corners. He often smiled. He had good eyes and a pair of fast hands, and he had a heart. He thought about the things, all the things, and he felt very deeply. I won't call him noble because what's a word to do with one of us? His name was Clifton, Todd Clifton, and like any man, he was born of women to live a while and then fall and die. So that's his tale to the minute. His name was Clifton, and for a while he lived among us and aroused a few hopes in the young manhood of man. And we know who knew him and loved him, and he died. So why are you waiting? You've heard it all. Why wait for more when all I do is repeat it? They stood and listened. Very well, so I'll tell you. His name was Clifton, and he was young, and he was a leader, and when he fell, there was a hole in the heel of his sock, and when he stretched forward, he seemed not as tall as he once stood. So he died, and we who would have loved him gathered here to mourn him. It's as simple as that, and as short as that. His name was Clifton, and he was black, and they shot him. Isn't that enough to tell? Isn't it all you need to know? Isn't that enough to appease your thirst for drama and send you home to sleep it off? Go take a drink and forget it, or read the daily news. His name was Clifton, and they shot him, and I was there to see him fall. So I know it as I know it. Here are the facts. He was standing and he fell. He fell and he kneeled. He kneeled and he bled. He bled and he died. He fell in a heap like any man, and his blood spilled out like any blood. Red as any blood. Wet as any blood. Reflecting the sky and the buildings and the birds and the trees, or your face if you look into its dulling mirror. And it dried in the sun as blood dries. That's all. They spilled his blood and he bled. They cut him down and he died. The blood flowed on the walk into the pool, gleamed a while, and after a while became dull and dusty, then dried. That's the story, and that's how it ended. It's an old story. There's been too much blood to excite you. Besides, it's only important when it fills the veins of a living man. Aren't you tired of such stories? Aren't you sick of the blood? Then why listen? Why don't you go? It's hot out here. There's the odor of an embalming fluid. The beer is cold in the taverns. The saxophone will be mellow at the Savoy. Plenty good laughing lies will be told in the barbershops and beauty parlors. And there will be sermons in 200 churches in the cool evening, and plenty of laughs at the movies. Go listen to Amos and Andy and forget it. Here you have the same old story. There's not even a young wife up here to mourn him in. There's nothing to give you or that good old frightening feeling. The story's too short and too simple. His name was Clifton, Todd Clifton, and he was unarmed, and his death was as senseless as his life was futile. He has struggled for brotherhood on 100 street corners, and he thought it would make him more human. But he died like any dog in a road.
So thank you for that, Clint. Very poignant. And I've read this book so many times, but I don't think I've ever had that passage read to me. And it brings a different kind of weight and gravity to it. And you can feel it in the room. It's great to be in community to hear a passage like that. Thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you, Gabrielle, for that fine introduction. It's such a pleasure. And to the First Lady for really lifting up the power of fiction and the power of reading to bring us in community together, to not only make it an individual pursuit, but something that illuminates all of our lives. So, Clint, why that passage?
Yeah, so I think obviously we're entering, or we have been in the midst of, over the course of the last several years, a series of recurring political moments in which we saw Black men and women and boys and girls who continue to be killed at the hands of police. And it's fascinating because we're in a moment right now in which it almost feels like we are made to feel almost as if it has stopped, right? Almost as if this was a sort of unique and sort of unprecedented moment in our sort of political history that we had not experienced before, and now that we are not experiencing anymore. But we know that not to be true, right? And I think part of why I wanted to bring it up is, and something I try to bring up in a lot of the conversations and discussions I have, is that simply because we're not seeing it anymore, and simply because it's not getting national coverage, and simply because Anderson Cooper is not in Ferguson, Missouri, does not mean that these things are not continuing to happen. And if you look at any of the data, people are being killed by police at the same rate as they were in sort of previous years. And I think that that's really unsettling, and obviously we are in a moment now where so much of the news cycle is being dominated by, I wish I could say a single thing, but it's 17,000 things a day. But I think it is important that we recognize, and I think, and I think your work is emblematic of this, that although there are so many sort of, I would call them sensationalists, but a lot of them are actually very important, so I won't say that, but that there are so many things happening in the news that deserve our attention. There are other things that aren't necessarily getting the sort of daily attention that both our national and local media are covering, but they remain really important to think about, and they are impacting the most marginalized of communities.
Yeah, indeed. So that passage that you selected, precisely as the First Lady says, tells us about the enduring quality of Ellison, many decades later, but also about what has changed and what has endured, and I was struck very much by and hearing it verbally about the incantation of Clifton's name, which struck me very much as the sort of hashtag moment around the repetition, say her name, say his name. So I wanted to ask you maybe to say a little bit about that, but also I was quite interested in hearing you read that passage about the poetry of Ellison, which I hadn't ever thought about. So there are these repetition of phrases that loop back that are, I think to hear it orally sort of really hits you in a different way. And what would you think about sort of putting your eyes as a poet on Ellison?
Yeah, I think, Ellison is certainly one of the most lyrical novelists that we've ever had. And he's a fascinating character, and, his biography is interesting, and the authors that he most looked up to were Joyce, Dostoevsky, Faulkner, T.S. Eliot. And I think there's actually, this is maybe as an aside that we want to sort of pin, but it is interesting that any time you go read an interview or read of him and hear about the people who most shaped his sort of literary sensibilities, they are all white men. And the great biography that was written about him kind of illuminates how he had a complicated relationship with a lot of other black writers, and that he was not necessarily supportive of a lot of black women writers that were sort of, when they were beginning to get more attention sort of toward the end of the 60s and into the 70s. But with that said, he certainly, the nature of his writing style was certainly one that is and has always been lyrical, deeply influenced by a lot of the Russian writers in that way. And you know, for me as a poet, you know, part of what I love about Ellison, and I think you see this in his essays as well, is the sort of a blurring of genres, right? Sort of a rejecting of this sort of idea of sort of genre compartmentalization and sort of pushing the limits of what constitutes as fiction or nonfiction or poetry or lyric. And that's something I've always really appreciated about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, you brought out the poetry, which hadn't really dawned on me in the same way before this evening. Certainly we understand him as a social realist writer who's representing, you see that in that passage as well, even with the poetry together, working together. He's very much pushing on the boundaries of magical realism, you know, and to my mind also, I'm gonna read a passage a little bit later, science fiction and horror of the experience. And so all of those genres for him are certainly in human experience, but also an African-American experience in particular, in a moment of Jim Crow. And that, you know, I'm always so struck that as a writer, he clearly feels that one has to not have the siloing of genres, exactly as you say, in order to be able to represent fully all that he's trying to convey about, you know, particularly Black experience in the early 20th century.
And I'm curious what you think about, to that point, right, this sort of blending of fiction and nonfiction, which is also a pretty, in the scope of human history, this idea of like fiction and nonfiction as distinct literary genres is pretty, a relatively new sort of phenomenon. But I'm curious how you think of, I think sometimes with many writers, especially novelists, there is a desire to put the writer's own life experiences in conversation with obviously what's happening in the text. Mm-hmm. And I think that is done to the nth degree with Black writers in ways that people immediately ask, is he the invisible man? Right. And I don't think that those questions are you know, illegitimate, but I'm curious how you think about the nature of autobiographies compared to fiction, and how you see that playing out and emerging in Ellison's work.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, surely, you know, certainly Ellison was asked that. He was asked, you know, repeatedly, are you the invisible man? And I think what's interesting about the uses of the different genres is that allows a kind of refusal, right? Because it's, you know, yes, it might be autobiographical, but I'm all of these things at once. And so even, you know, so even that move brings a kind of dynamism and I think multiplicity to the experience or the representation of the Black male writer or the Black writer that refuses to be pigeonholed as only a social realist writer, as only a writer who, you know, writes with a kind of magical realism tilt. He's sort of, you know, I'm all of these things at once. If you want to, you know, accuse me of only sort of making an autobiographical gesture here. It's also a refusal. I mean, part of the autobiographical move is often, you know, that the writer is a kind of idiot savant, that you're writing out of your own experience and there's not craftsmanship here. And so also his move from genre to genre is also, I think, could be read as a kind of braggadocio, a kind of bragging about the craft. Like, I can do this, and I can do this, and I can do this.
Which would be very in line with his character.
Indeed, right? And still all bring it together in a narrative form that is indeed an American classic.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find most interesting about Ellison as a writer is the sort of self-confidence that exuded from some, and it sort of emanates from so much of his work, but he very much took seriously, and this can, you know, one can put this in conversation with the idea of who he sort of lifts up as his literary idols. I think that Ellison very much was in a sort of constant pursuit of legitimacy beyond the idea of the Negro writer, right? If you read all the reviews that came out when The Invisible Man came out, it was praised, but it was praised in many ways as like, I remember the New York Times said, never has a novel been written like this. Never has a novel or story like this been written by a Negro writer. And every sort of review and so much of the conversation around his work was animated and qualified by how he is among the best of the Negro writers. When for Ellison, he very much was not wanting to be a part of that type of conversation. He wanted to have his work in conversation with Dostoevsky and Eliot and Faulkner and Joyce, and he wanted to be considered among the literary greats where and he's someone who himself did not, he may in some way have contributed to that himself, because he would talk about how there were like very few black writers who he thought were like true literary geniuses. And again, they were mostly, all of the folks that he lifted up were white men. So it's interesting to think about questions of how one's sense or desire to be perceived with a specific sort of legitimacy shapes the very nature of the art that they subsequently create. And obviously makes me think of Langston Hughes' great essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, where today we would call it a subtweet to County Cullen. But he in essence is saying that, part of a black writer should not feel like they cannot write about certain things or use certain language simply because they don't believe that it will be considered of great literary merit, right? And that you should not, if you want to write about, things that have nothing to do with race and racism and that don't use the sort of colloquialisms of the black community or the community from which you come, that's fine, but you shouldn't do that singularly because you think that in order to be a great writer, you must reject the things that make you who you are. And it's interesting to think about, Ellison and Langston also didn't have a great relationship themselves for most of their adult lives, but it's interesting to sort of put those details in conversation with one another.
Yeah, I also think he was, in the midst of he was writing what he imagined as the paradox of the Negro. So he was trying to, I think, also figure himself out in that way. There's this Harper's essay from 1964, Harlem is Nowhere, that Ellison writes, and there's a couple of interesting passages, and one is, and he's musing at Harlem as a place that has, because of the Great Migration, a generation who's come, from rural towns and villages to the cities, and he uses phrases like people going from being cotton pickers to having, children training as atomic scientists, people from being cooks and cleaners to people training to be surgeons. And so he's very much, I think, also in that moment, writing somewhat autobiographically as someone who's also making that kind of transition and leap, coming from Tulsa, and becoming, part of the New York literati, and placing himself, on par with Dostoevsky, Joyce, and others, and rightly so, and indeed. And so he's such an interesting sort of paradoxical figure for me in that way, because he's so deeply. He so helps us to understand the Great Migration and that way, and what it meant for migrants. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson gets this so right in her book as well. I mean,
has everybody read
The Warmth of Other Suns? Yeah,
if you haven't, you should. It's one of the best books, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's remarkable. Great audiobook as well. It's very long.
It's extraordinary, but she captures that migrant experience, and that so much of African American experience is coming from elsewhere and to places like Harlem, and making that sort of quantum leap from cotton picker to atomic scientist. I mean, in a generation in some cases, and still facing the Clifton experience, right? Like all of that's together, and so that does also suggest for us why all of his generic twists and turns are necessary in a book like Invisible Man, because how do you begin to account for that kind of change in a generation?
Yeah, and I think, generally the Great Migration, this is what Wilkerson does so remarkably in her book, like should be in many ways very much understood as sort of internal refugee crisis, in which people were experiencing terrorism in the South, and they said, we have to escape this. And so they went to Chicago, they went to Harlem, they went to Los Angeles. Even my own family, right? I'm born and raised in New Orleans, and so many people on my mother's side of the family relocated from New Orleans, as many did, to Los Angeles and other parts of Southern California. And there was a sort of obsessiveness I think you see in Ellison's work, that so much of who he was and the work that he did, and again, this sense of legitimacy and this sense of having a sense of himself moving up on what one can argue is either a real or imagined sort of social hierarchy, is tied to the obsessiveness of him wanting to like escape the abject poverty that he grew up in. Yeah, and I think that was a huge catalyst for many folks during the Great Migration, and I think animated a lot of the decisions that people made and the way people raised their children, and a host of things that that in many ways obviously became intergenerational in the Black community, right? Like, I think of my own childhood and the rhetoric of like, you don't understand like how your grandparents were living in Mississippi. And anytime, I was like, I don't want to study for this test, or I want to go play at Tommy's house. And she's like, you guys, why can't you guys be like John's parents? And my dad's like, John don't live in this house. And then he walks away very dramatically because he thinks he's Denzel Washington. But but that sense of this, it's almost a sense of precariousness, a sense of fragility.
Precisely.
Right? That this could so easily be taken away. That like only a generation ago we didn't have enough food to eat, and that really shapes so much of the sort of artistic and intellectual and personal fervor that I think Ellison navigated the entirety of his life with.
No, I think that's right, and that you never know when the Clifton moment can come, right? It can be at any moment. So we share family, and my father's from New Orleans and migrated to Los Angeles. Oh, wow. And yeah, so we share that.
What's
we
his
share
last
that
name?
migration. We are.
My grandmother used to say every Black person
Absolutely.
who can read and write knows each other, which is
so
both
we
true
are
and problematic.
Mondays. We are Mondays. We're half Anglophone, half Francophone. So it's Mundy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Among others.
We could be cousins.
You never know. So I wanted to ask you, this is Clint's wonderful book of poetry, Counting Descent, here. And, he begins this marvelous book with an epigram from Ellison. And so, I'm also a writer. I begin chapters and books with epigrams, and, they're meant to be profound. They're meant to really say something about all of the pages that come after. And so your Ellison passage is, I recognize no dichotomy between art and protest. So do you want to say a little bit about where that comes from and why you chose it?
Yeah, so this is from a 1954 Paris Review interview that he did, which is an interview that the Paris Review did so many wonderful interviews across decades, but this is one that I revisit very often. And in it, he's being asked, as he was always asked, and as many Black writers of that time and of this time are asked. I mean, you can see the same sort of thing happening to Ryan Coogler and Ava DuVernay and Ta-Nehisi Coates right now, in terms of what is the responsibility of the Black artist to the sort of project of Black liberation or social change or the political movement. And Ellison was always wanted to be very clear, and he was kind of a little bit snarky too, right? He wanted to push back against the idea that he took issue with the idea that only Black artists and Black writers were being asked this question, right? He was kind of like, no one is asking Dostoevsky these questions about like what the social responsibility of his art to the sort of broader social movement of his people is. People aren't asking James Joyce these questions, but you ask me in ways that that almost sort of don't allow for any other reading of the text other than one that is very much through the lens of how is this contributing to the project of freedom or Black liberation. And in the sort of broader quote, he's kind of saying like, all art is protest. All art is a protest. Fiction in and of itself is like a protest against that which is existing around us, right? The very project of sort of imagining a different world is a protest against the world as it exists. And I come back to that and sort of think about that a lot, obviously, as someone who is both deeply concerned, obviously, with so many of the issues that we see in our that's happening around us, but also someone who is a writer and an artist that obviously whose work is shaped in large part by these things, but whose work is not singularly defined by these things as well. And I think that that's a tension that Black academics and Black writers and Black artists have had to negotiate and navigate for a long time. But I know you have something that you wanted to read, and I would love to hear that.
We're supposed to go to Q&A, but I wanted to just read briefly a short passage from Ellison that puts us in a different space that's a bit more sort of speculative, because it's about sort of encounters with medicine and encounters with science, and because I think it would be, as a wonderful entree to, I think, thinking about one of the First Lady McRae's signature pursuits in her role as First Lady, which has been around mental health care, around the new NYC Well campaign, and more recently the Sisters Thrive campaign. So I just want to read a few paragraphs from this, and then we will open things up for conversation with you, which we very much look forward to. This is from chapter 11, and this is the unnamed protagonist speaking. I was sitting in a cold, white, rigid chair, and a man was looking at me out of the bright third eye that glowed from the center of his forehead. He reached out, touching my skull gingerly, and said something encouraging as though I were a child. His fingers went away. "Take this," he said. "It's good for you." I swallowed. Suddenly, my skin itched all over. I had on new overalls, strange white ones. The taste ran bitter through my mouth. My fingers trembled. A thin voice with a mirror on the end of it said, "How is he?" "I don't think it's anything serious, merely stunned." "Should he be sent home now?" "No, just to be certain, we'll keep him here a few days. Want to keep him under observation, then he may leave." Now I was lying on a cot. The bright eye was still burning into mine, although the man was gone. It was quiet, and I was numb. I closed my eyes, only to be awakened. "What is your name?" a voice said. "My head," I said. "Yes, but your name. Address?" "My head, that burning eye," I said. "Eye?" "Inside," I said. "Shoot him up for an X-ray," another voice said. "My head. Careful." Somewhere a machine began to hum, and I distrusted the man and the woman above me. They were holding me firm, and it was fiery, and above all, I kept hearing the opening motif of Beethoven's Fifth. 3 short and 1 long buzz, repeated again and again in varying volume, and I was struggling and breaking through and rising up to find myself lying on my back with 2 pink-faced men laughing down. "Be quiet now. You'll be all right." I raised my eyes, seeing 2 indefinite young women in white looking down at me. A third, a desert of heat waves away, sat on a panel arrayed with coils and dials. Where was I? Far from below me, a barber chair thumping began, and I felt myself rise on the tip of the sound from the floor. A face was now level with mine, looking closely and saying something without meaning. A whirring began that snapped and cracked with static, and suddenly I seemed to be crushed between floor and ceiling. 2 forces tore savagely at my stomach and back. A flash of cold-edge heat enclosed me. I was pounded between crushing electrical pressures, pumped between live electrodes like an accordion between a player's hands. My lungs were compressed like a bellows, and each time my breath returned, I yelled, punctuating the rhythmical action of the nodes. So later it goes on, and he's encountering a frontal lobotomy, and all sorts of other things happen to our unnamed narrator, who is sometimes reliable and maybe sometimes not. Yeah. Yeah. So we would love to hear from you about your experience of encountering, maybe for the first time, or re-encountering this great book, and your thoughts about that. Yes. Well, wait, would you hold on and wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
I probably read this first 30 years ago, have read it many times over the years. And I think what strikes me most is actually a sadness, how I feel the same, more than different each time I read it, that much progress maybe hasn't been made to some of the themes he touches on. But I'm particularly interested, I'm sure you're both familiar with Toni Morrison's comments about this book. And given she's one of the great African-American authors as well, she's very critical, especially of the title. So I was wondering what you both, and if you're, I'm sure you are familiar with what.
And so,
I'm not actually, so.
Oh,
please,
I
you know.
can.
so I believe you're referring to the idea that Toni Morrison took issue with the idea that Ralph Ellison would suggest that that he is invisible, and question, like, invisible to whom, right? Because you're not invisible to Black women who have been providing for you and supporting you and lifting you up when the rest of the world is trying to tear you down. So in part, that he is seeing himself through the sort of proverbial white gaze, rather than a group of other people who are not seeing, you know, this protagonist as an invisible person. It's interesting, and I think the idea of invisibility is obviously one that is not an objective phenomenon, right? Like, one can be both visible and invisible to different groups of people. Something that, when I wrote this piece for The New Yorker about a year ago, I was thinking a lot about my students. So I taught in Prince George's County, Maryland, and many of my students were undocumented. And for them, it's interesting because I brought this book and put it on the syllabus and thinking that my students would, as many folks do, think about invisibility in the context of Black people not being fully seen as human in a world that is predicated on their subjugation. But many of my students, particularly the undocumented students, but other students as well, thought of invisibility in a very different way. Like, that invisibility was actually a very necessary facet of their lives, right? Especially and especially now, in a moment where they literally exist under an existential threat in a way that has not been seen in many years. And so I think, you know, I think that Toni Morrison's reading is completely fair, because I think that people can have a lot of different readings around these things. I also, you know, not to pull the autobiography into it too much, they had a complicated relationship. Ellison wasn't very supportive. I think there was right before Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize for Literature, there was a sort of big effort led by Henry Louis Gates and others to have people recognize that Toni Morrison should be a fixture on the Western and American literary canon, which ultimately was remarkably successful. And Ellison was not a supporter of that initiative, and thought of it as sort of pandering. And I can imagine, it would be possible that is shaping the way Toni Morrison thinks about Ellison's work in any review that she might have.
There's also an interesting, I think, parallelism in that I think it's the Morrison novel Love. There's a scene that's not unlike the scene that I describe here, right? She's writing about a veteran who returns from war and ends up the sort of victim and object of medical experimentation. So what's interesting in this account, though, is this is someone who's known to people and who are people wondering about where he is, unlike, you know, our invisible narrator, where it's, you know, there's, I mean, you know, I think where she's, as Clint suggests, where she's really right in the critique is that there's no sense that there's a community that cares about this narrator. And I think even in her rendering of a very similar scenario, people are looking for this man and know who he is, and he's returned to a family and to a community and the like. And so it's interesting to think about how two of them have written, I don't even know if she realizes it, but quite similar scenes. Yeah.
One of the sections that really touched me very deeply in the book was the part where he got expelled from school, and I was very mad about that, and I just would like for you to put that in the social context of today, because I felt like that man that he just looked up to, and he totally surrendered all of his trust and his hope in that man, and he just betrayed him and then expelled him from school and really derailed him in the course of his life. And but he was not. I did not get the impression that he was really bitter or hateful towards him, and I just felt like his silence and his lack of access to not having a voice, I would say, or not having people to just report to or take his complaint to, he became sort of like complicit to his own demise. So I just would like for you to put that in the social context of today.
So I might defer to our education scholar first, and then I'll weigh in.
Yeah. I think that sort of scene, a series of scenes in the book, this kind of harkens back to what we were discussing before, like the ideas of legitimacy. And I think that the president of the university, the black president of the university, who is, could be an avatar of Booker T. Washington in a not so subtle way, perceives his own movement, again, because this is this sort of precarity and this sort of urgent desire to move up at different types of social hierarchies was sort of present in every facet of the black community, right? So for this man, I think his sense of himself and his ability to have upward mobility on this social hierarchy was completely tied to how he was perceived by the white benefactor, right? And so anything that upset this benefactor was seen not just as a threat to the university, but like as a threat to his sense of self and the possibilities of him as a man who wants to move up and gain a stronger sense of self in the world. So that is, like in my reading, that is why he was promptly kicked out, right? Because this represented like a very personal threat, and not just one that was sort of an affront to the school. And yeah.
So thank you for sharing your sorrow, because I feel very much the same way about, in many points in the book, as you suggest, particularly as you reread it. For me, it was also about knowing that in African American communities, education is sought as the thing that lifts you up and out, right? And so to have that, that gold ring or that parachute sort of the possibility ripped from you, sort of then, as you say, casts him into all of the other things that happen, right? I mean, if that's supposed to be the avenue to social mobility, then you're left to sort of make your way without the vehicle for social mobility, particularly in this moment in the United States. I mean, I think that education has become much more complicated, and you can look back at the halcyon days where people could sort of, have the right mentors, go to the right schools, and sort of move forward. But as schools have become, more criminalized, have been, less sites of hope and more of sorrow, I think this is capturing it. And it's another moment where Ellison is really so prescient, right, about what might happen with education at the hands of others. I think, indeed, not so much Booker T. Washington figures, but about how important it is and what it means when it's lost, that option.
Yes, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as to why the author chose not to give a name to the protagonist. I mean, I think there were two major, of course, not not equally important, but the protagonist was left without a name, and the founder of the college was always referred to as the founder. He was never given a name either. So I was somewhat puzzled by that.
I think critics have been writing about that since the book was published. So there's lots of theories. I mean, so we can say about the founder that the founder has no name, but the founder has a social role, has a social scientist, and a social status. So without a founder doesn't need a name because the founder is powerful, and we know that founder comes with the word founder comes with all of these sort of entitlements and rights. One theory is that the Invisible Man doesn't have a name because he's every man, right? So he stands in for the sort of multiplicity of lots of different people's experiences. I think the First Lady captured, another interpretation, which is about the experience of variously marginalized people being unseen. There's sort of moments, moments in which you sort of get a sense of feeling what it's like to move in the world, and you're at sort of important historical events, or all sorts of things are happening around him and the book, and you get a sense of what it literally means to not matter and to be unseen in that way. So I would offer those two as interpretations, but quite literally, literary critics have been thinking about this and writing about this for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is one of the beautiful things about art is that that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, and a lot of people can have a lot of different reasons to their mind as to why that was the rationale, and all of those reasons can be right, it's interesting even when people ask me about my book is I feel very grateful is taught in like a lot of high schools, and sometimes I'll Skype with the students and they'll say, what does this line in this poem means? And I try not to give answers to those types of questions because it means whatever it means to you, right? Like it is not, once an artist creates something and puts it out into the world, the way that art is interpreted is no longer in the hands of the artist, right? And so in many ways, to my mind, it's kind of irrelevant what my intention was, because different people bring their own lenses, their own experiences, their own sets of ideas to any interpretation of art across a range of genres. And I think that this, whether, the reason for the sort of the I as the singular protagonist as compared to a name is another one of those things that can have a lot of different answers that I think are correct.
In that vein, in a formal sense, the famous epilogue where he finished the novel and yet talks to his editors about something's not wrong. He doesn't, in my mind, he emphatically throws out what you're saying, this could be any man. Do you agree?
Throws out in the sense that that's what he states?
Rejects it? Or?
Out in the voice of the invisibilism, he talks in his sort of stentorian way to the reader. That last sentence, the famous sentence.
I haven't read the epilogue in some time, so I'm not sure I can.
What's the stentorian last sentence that you're? Oh, yeah. About being in low frequencies, living in low frequencies.
It's when he's in the basement?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, he's got all of his lights and.
Got it.
I don't know. This could be you. Yeah, but he also still is. I mean, I guess for me, that part of the work is really about having lived an experience of being unseen. He now has sort of taken it into a kind of, he's now in a kind of compound mentality. I mean, he's sort of gone inside. So the sort of experience of being invisible is just like almost giving up. Like, I'm going to go into this compound and sort of just be in this space. For me, I don't know if it's coming out of an invisibility more than it is a kind of reckoning with it, and a kind of isolation, a kind of acceptance of a kind of isolation. Very good. Would you read that last paragraph? That's terrific.
I'm just going to say that it doesn't say, it says, who knows but that on lower frequencies I speak for you, question mark. It says a question mark is the last.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that a little bit less. It remains a question mark.
Yes.
Okay. No, but I had another question, which is, So I'm more coming from like the visual arts side of things. I'm thinking about the trajectory of the idea of sort of like the political versus the sort of more complex and elliptical works of art, and how the trajectory of people's reputations. And so right now there's a higher tolerance for like straight up political art in the visual arts. I was just
Who's the
wondering-
ideal type for you of this?
Oh, for me?
Yes.
Oh, so I don't know. Somebody like Lorraine O'Grady's like back up on top, and she's like getting her day in the sun. Like we wanted a revolution. That group of black feminists at the Brooklyn Museum.
Yes,
That kind of
yes,
stuff. Like
yes, yeah.
straight up, identity politics. We're back. We're going to say who we are. We're not. Blah blah blah. Okay. So I'm just wondering, so where are we at with Ralph Ellison in terms of his reputation? Because he won the National Book Award, presumably a completely white jury. I don't know, maybe, right? One would assume, gave him that award for this book, which was very complex and Russian. I was just thinking how Russian it was, yeah. Where is he at, or is his reputation still at the pinnacle? I don't know. That was my question.
I think I want to hear what Clint has to say about this. I feel that there's a kind of tragedy there, right? I mean, he has this other novel that burns, and then there's the unfinished novel that others finish, that is finished by the estate, and so it feels like we have to we're left to sort of understand. We've got all the beautiful essays, of course, as well, but we're left to sort of take Invisible Man as Ellison in some ways at the height of his power, because there's not anything that comes after, and we have to sort of imagine in some ways what might have come after. So it feels very tragic to me. I mean, I think his place in certainly the American canon, and I hope in a kind of world canon is rock solid. But there's also a tragedy there because there's so much work that one wants, and his struggle to do more work, and to lose the work and then to not quite accomplish it. Leaves him as I think a figure well established in the canon, but also a deeply tragic one.
And I imagine it also depends on who you're asking with regard to his reputation, right? I mean, part of what I think is one of the fascinating things about Ellison is that even in he obviously kind of rode the wave of the success of Invisible Man throughout the entirety of his career, but certainly in the 50s and 60s was considered the preeminent, among the preeminent, if not the preeminent black writer. But a lot of, one could argue, and critics have argued, that was largely from the white community, right? And that, because this was also a moment when, a writer like Baldwin cannot disentangle himself from the civil rights movement, right? And even though he made an effort to sort of, I need to get away, I'm going to go to Paris, France, Turkey, all these different places, he ultimately continues to come back because there's a sort of moral impetus for him to do so, and he very purposefully develops relationships with Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar Evers, and all of these different folks in a way that Ralph Ellison very much did the opposite, very much sought to sort of keep himself away and distance from the civil rights movement and keep his sort of work distance from it in ways that were incredibly frustrating at that time for a lot of black folks and black activists who expected, someone who is the preeminent, one of the preeminent intellectuals and writers of his generation to almost sort of refuse to be involved at all in one of the greatest social movements in the history of the world. I think left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouth, but and so I think it kind of depends on who you're asking, and his reputation. It is very clear that Invisible Man is a staple of the Western canon, but the question is always at what cost.
Last question. The gentleman in the back who has the mic already. Sorry, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay, I got the last question here. I want to make 2 points before I ask the question. First is, you said all art is protest. And just from studying philosophy, African-American philosophy, and then reading texts from like Du Bois, it does come from that the white gaze perspective, and it's also almost expected of African-Americans to write from an oppressive standpoint. I'm not sure if that's a good assessment, but my question is, what are your advice in creating art that could shape or reshape culture and society instead of being this protest, this voice of sadness. And even in Invincible Man, Clifton ended up dying, and that's the central point of it all. As opposed to when you read Charles Dickens, you get the Christmas Carol or Pip or Great Expectations and things like that. How can you create art that changes that type of thing?
So I think, in my mind, reject the premise. I think the idea, and this is kind of what I get to with the epigraph, was I recognize no dichotomy between art and protest, right? Like in my mind, these things are not mutually exclusive. I think we tell ourselves sometimes that protest art exists or political art exists in one specific category, and the sort of ars poetica, arts for art's sake, more complex type of art exists in a different category. And I think there are a range of artists across mediums, across genre, who create work that is deeply political without sacrificing or compromising the sort of artistic integrity and complexity of their work. And I think, I think Dickens is, A Tale of Two Cities is an incredibly political novel in my mind, but again, this question of like, what are people imputing on the text and bringing to their reading of the text based on the identity of the writer in ways that make it so that when somebody reads Dickens, it's like, oh, well, this is clearly about these sort of universal themes of love and tragedy and what have you, whereas another writer who might be black, if Charles Dickens was black, I guarantee you that A Tale of Two Cities would be read, like critiqued and read and understood in like a very different way than it is now.
Indeed, and I'm sitting here thinking that there's a read of Invisible Man that is Dickensian. I mean, it is the trials and travails of a character that you follow throughout. Ups and downs and all around. So it's an interesting point. So we will end it at that. I want to thank the First Lady for hosting Clinton, myself. I think that I can speak for both of us in saying that it's a tremendous honor to speak as part of the Gracie Book Club that she is hosting us here, and also to be together on this penultimate day of Black History Month 2018 to talk about a great African American classic and also a great American classic.
Indeed. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
And thank you to Gracie for having us.